Welcome to ILTV News, here with a special broadcast live from Hostage Square. We'll be reporting from the ground about the hostage release of U.S.-Israeli citizen Sagi Dekel-Khan, who has been kidnapped since October 7th, as well as Yair Horn. And of course, the third hostage today we are seeing released is Alexander Sasha Trufanov, an Israeli-Russian citizen. So this is the sixth such hostage release. We are live with coverage from the ground inside Gaza as well. You can see the footage from Khan Yunis, where crowds are already gathering. Now, from initial reports, we know that the Red Cross is already on the way to receive the hostages from Hamas captivity, from Hamas hands, where they will eventually be transferred into IDF hands and back home to their families after receiving the proper necessary medical checks. In addition to that, we know that today there will be a release of 369 convicted terrorists. Of those, I believe there are 36 who are serving life sentences. So it's sure to be an emotional day for the Israeli public. And here in Hostage Square, we already see that there are crowds gathering to receive updates about what's going on in this hostage release. We'll be giving you all the updates from the ground here in Israel, together with the ILTV team, as well as Shosh Bedrosian here on the ground in Tel Aviv. Shosh?
Good morning. Good to have you in Hostage Square this morning. We've been following all of these hostages releases over the last 6 weeks. This is the sixth hostage release we have covered. Like you said, we're expected to have 3 male hostages coming out today. All 3 of these men were taken from Kibbutz Nir Oz. Kibbutz Nir Oz was one of the very small kibbutzim in the south, heavily impacted by what happened on October 7th. Nearly 1 in 4 people were affected, either murdered or taken hostage by Hamas terrorists on October 7th. We are expecting some very emotional reunions to take place today. One of those I'd like to talk about is the second American to be released as part of this ceasefire hostage deal in this first phase. This is Sagi Dekel-Khan, 36 years old. He has no idea his family survived October 7th. His wife, his pregnant wife at the time, and his 2 young children hid in the safe room while he confronted Hamas terrorists. He was working in the machine shop on Nir Oz at the time in the morning of October 7th. He was one of the first people to alert the entire kibbutzim that Hamas terrorists infiltrated their fence, their borders, and confronted them. He was then taken hostage. His family was in the safe room. And 2 months after he was taken hostage, his wife gave birth to their 3rd daughter, Shachar. She turned 1 year old in December. And so he will be reuniting to see them for the first time, but to see his daughter for the first time. You know, we've talked about these emotional reunions. We've heard these amazing stories, but also really sad stories, like last week of Eli Sharabi, and we're going to continue to make sure we highlight all of these. It's important to do that.
Right. I mean, I think that one of the most disturbing things that we've seen throughout these hostage release events is that it has been turned into somewhat of a show. We saw this with, of course, Palestinian Islamic Jihad in one of the previous releases, starting with the release of Arbel Yehud. And in addition to that, we saw that after in the last hostage release with Eli Sharabi and the other hostages who came out in really shocking conditions. I think that the entire, of course, the Israeli public, although we know that Hamas is a terrorist organization, it's quite shocking to see hostages coming out of this horrific, period of captivity looking honestly like they walked out of a Holocaust. I mean, really, really disturbing scenes. And unfortunately, from what we've seen on the ground already, as Hamas and Islamic Jihad are setting up on the ground inside of Khan Yunis, we see the scenes now. Actually, now on the screen, you can see some of the banners that have been set up by Hamas and Islamic Jihad on the ground. They have here with the red triangles indicating what their next target is, something that's been used by the terror group since October 7th. They put pictures of the different kibbutzim that they raided with the text actually in English that says, "We crossed over swiftly," bragging, boasting about the massacre that took place on October 7th. And of course, in addition to that, we see a rejection of U.S. President Trump's proposal to relocate some of this Gaza population, where it says there will be no immigration except to Jerusalem. And of course, the images that are depicted there in that screen are alluding to Yahya Sinwar, the assassination of Yahya Sinwar. You can see that in the images there. So clearly there is no rejection of terrorism in any way, shape or form. We see a doubling down, as somewhat expected from Hamas terror groups on the ground. You did mention something positive we expect to see with the reunification of Sagi Dekelkhan's family. In addition to that, we do have bittersweet news today, of course, with Alexander Sasha Trufanov, whose family was also taken hostage on October 7th. Some of them were released in the previous exchanges, but I believe he isn't aware. We don't know that he's aware that his father was also killed on October 7th. Shosh, what can you tell us about Sasha?
Yeah, so Sasha actually has Russian citizenship, and something to really talk about are the ties between Russia and Hamas. Russia has made sure to keep a strong relationship with certain key players in the region of the Middle East, especially Hamas. They have really been pushing Hamas to release Sasha and another Russian hostage that is still in captivity at this time. And so it seems as if Hamas spokesperson indicated to Russia within the last few weeks that they will be releasing Sasha Trufanov.
I just want to note for our viewers now, what you're actually seeing on the screen is the footage of the release papers being given to Sasha Trufanov in Hamas captivity, where he is set to be released today. Really a disturbing scene. We've seen this kind of propaganda be put out by Hamas in almost every single hostage release, and I think it really begs the question, what is the international community doing about such a scene, such a celebration of exploitation of innocent civilian hostages? I mean, these are not soldiers we're talking about here. These are civilians who were dragged from their homes, their families murdered. As you mentioned, in the case of Sasha, his father was murdered, and we have no idea if he's even aware of that.
Right, we have no idea. And just for our viewers to know, the last time we saw a PIJ, Palestinian Islamic Jihad video come out was before the release of Gadi Moses and Arbel Yehud. They also released a video ahead of their release, which they were also held by PIJ, and that handover was of serious concern. We know that Israel is looking out to see how their ceremony will go today with Sasha as well. Last time Gadi Moses and Arbel Yehud were released, they were surrounded by swarms of hundreds of people just trying to get a glimpse, touching them. The handover it could have been catastrophic. It could have really done something serious to their lives, and it was a very hard scene to watch, as we've seen Hamas handovers be a little bit more organized and choreographed, I think is the word to use, choreographed on purpose, with cameras, with scripts, with hostages being prepared, needing to say things on stage in their way of continuing just to weaponize and to harm these people the last final time that they can before they're handed over to Israel. So it's just important to note that everything that we see today is done on purpose by PIJ, by Hamas, all done in a very specific way. You mentioned on the banners. These are brand new banners they print every single week. Every single week we're seeing a new way of how they're facilitating these handovers. What else can you tell us just about these ceremonies? Well, how else do they prepare for things like this?
Well, I mean, I think it's really important to note that every time we've seen these scenes, this staged act take place, first of all, they are parading these hostages across a stage. I mean, they have set up a whole production in order to humiliate these hostages. And of course, this is a propaganda exercise in order to send a message to the world, to the Arab world, and to the Palestinian people that Hamas is still there. This is their way of saying that they still exist and that they're strong, whether or not these alleged, fighters on the ground are actually members of Hamas, if they've ever been involved in anything. We know that this terror group has been dealt a very heavy blow when it comes to their control over the Gaza Strip, and now it's getting even more intense, with the beginning of President Trump's new term in the United States. I mean, we saw President Trump's reaction to the previous hostage exchange when we saw Eli Sharabi looking, gaunt, like he had been starved for 16 months, walking across the stage, even being told, to express who he's most excited to see. And of course, in a very twisted turn of events, Hamas actually told him to specifically note that he was looking forward to seeing his wife and children. And it's important to note that his wife and children were murdered on October 7th. And Hamas, of course, knew that because they did it. So this is the level of depravity that we're working with on the ground here with this terrorist organization. And then, of course, we see the scenes with goodie bags. Hamas has been giving goodie bags to all of the hostages with certificates noting their time in captivity. They gave the female soldiers who were released, they gave them photographs, mementos from Gaza. I mean, really sick, twisted behavior. And I think it's also important to note for our viewers that this in and of itself is a violation of international law. You can see even on the Red Cross's website, the irony, on the Red Cross's website, that there is a specific provision that dictates how prisoners of war or hostages are to be treated, and it explicitly states that they're not permitted to be paraded across stage or in crowds, rambunctious crowds like we saw in Gaza with Hamas and Islamic Jihad. And you mentioned that the scenes could have very easily spiraled out of control. Unfortunately, not something that's foreign to us in Israel. This is something that has happened in the past with Israeli citizens when it comes to lynching and violent attacks. But I think that it's probably safe to assume that the hostage release today, which is both Palestinian Islamic Jihad and Hamas, is taking place in one location. Now, initially we were told this would probably be taking place in two locations, and I have to speculate that maybe because Palestinian Islamic Jihad is not able really to control the masses and the crowds of terror supporters on the ground there in Gaza. It's been frightening scenes, quite frankly, to see every other person with a $1,000 camera in addition to guns. That's pretty much all you see being paraded around.
Yeah, and it's something we're also going to be looking out for today is, of course, what these hostages are wearing. We said to make sure that our viewers, when you look at the video Hamas is releasing, to really have the lens on of looking at every detail, every single outfit that these hostages walk out of Hamas captivity with is hand-selected for a reason. Last week we saw Or Levy, who was also in an emaciated state, was wearing some type of military outfit. We saw Ohad Ben Ami and Ali Sharabi wearing a jumpsuit with their own photo on the sweatshirt, photos of what they looked like before Hamas captivity. I think it's really important to note that this week was very dramatic because Hamas said this week that they would be delaying this hostage release. That turned pretty much all of Israeli society a little bit upside down. We had these emotions from these families after we saw these three men completely emaciated coming out, and Hamas saying, well, we're going to delay this release because Israel is not giving us enough aid and they're not giving us enough tents as they said they would in the ceasefire deal. What happened next? Trump came out with a statement saying not only do these hostages released look like Holocaust survivors, but if all hostages are released by Saturday at noon, he said, quote, all hell will break loose. We saw Netanyahu echo the same sentiments, saying all hell will break loose and they will return to intense fighting in the Gaza Strip if these hostages aren't released. We later in the week saw Israel say, okay, if you don't release all hostages, we will accept the three that are set to be planned for release on Saturday. And finally, at the end of the week, we saw Hamas say, yes, okay, we will go ahead with what we planned for the ceasefire deal. So there's been a lot of emotion for these hostage families this week. Will there be a release? Will there not be? What will this look like for phase 2, the end of phase 1? What else can you tell us about the chaos this week that happened?
Absolutely. I mean, it was high drama throughout the week. I mean, quite frankly, when it comes to these hostage negotiations and the entire situation, it's been this way throughout the entire war for 16 months. A very, very painful and lengthy situation for all of these hostage families that is continuing even until this second. You can see the crowds gathering here in Tel Aviv on the ground. I just want to update you guys. We have gotten some updates from the Arab media that there is at least some kind of slight delay in the hostage release. They have not given a reason for that. We'll continue to keep you updated of what's happening on the ground when it comes to that. And there are reports, at least in the Arab media, that Hamas is planning on forcing some of these hostages to give a speech on stage. We are getting reports that Yair Horn has been asked to give a speech to the families in Hebrew. It remains to be seen. I'm not sure if we will be broadcasting that, as it is a complete violation of international law to force hostages in such a situation to do these things. But we will be keeping you updated on the ground of what is happening with that. I think it's also important to note that we did receive reports just this morning, according to Hamas, that they will be returning the hostages or moving the hostages from location to location in the Israeli vehicles that they stole on October 7th. So they will be transporting these hostages in the actual vehicles that they used to kidnap them 16 months ago, in yet another example of their cynicism and really depraved way of going about this hostage release. And I think it's also really important to note that this contrasts entirely with Israel's response when it comes to releasing these convicted terrorists, despite the fact that on the Hamas side, these are innocent civilians who were kidnapped from their homes. They're not combatants. There was no state of war. These are civilians. Whereas on the other side, on the Palestinian prisoner side, these are actually convicted terrorists, with at least 36 of them serving life sentences in Israeli prisons. So there's quite a contrast here. And unfortunately, I think we've seen even some of the media report erroneously that this is a hostage exchange. I want to note that it's important to understand this is not a hostage exchange. It is a release of convicted terrorists that are in Israeli prisons. On the Gaza side, of course, we're talking about civilians. Correct. These are hostages.
And it's important to note, you said convicted, right? Convicted because they went through a trial to get that conviction, to get that life sentence. As you mentioned, 36 prisoners being released today are serving life sentences for either aiding, sponsoring, being part of murdering Israelis in terror attacks. These people have really done a horrific crime here, and they're serving time for it. Israel remains the only democracy in the Middle East, so that is why they went through a trial. They stood on trial. They were part of an entire democratic process to get them to the point where they are in prison after a swift trial that happens in a democracy. As you mentioned before, the Red Cross is heading over to receive these hostages right now. I want to go back a little bit to their stories and who these people are. I think it's really important to humanize the people coming out today. They've spent 498 days in Hamas captivity. We've also heard stories of these mail release hostages that have come out. We mentioned the emaciated conditions, and something so critical that we have heard is that as these male hostages come out, we are also hearing about the other hostages still in captivity. They're able to bring a token of knowledge for the families still wanting any bit of information that they possibly can to hear about how their loved one is doing. This week specifically, we heard signs of life from more than 10 hostages still in Hamas captivity. There's knowledge, there's information. We're hoping to learn more information as these other 3 male hostages are coming back this week. But recently, we've heard emotional stories of one hostage in particular, Alon Ohel. He was taken from the Nova Music Festival. One of the released hostages from last week said that they were held with him in captivity at one point. They say that Alon is being shackled in tunnels. He has shrapnel injuries to his shoulder, to his stomach, to his eye. Specifically his eye, they've reported that he can only see shadows out of. And Alon, although he is injured, he's not set to be released in this first phase of this deal. These men have received maybe even less than a pita per day to eat. We've heard about these horrific conditions they've been held in. What else can you tell us about either who these people are or what we've heard about the conditions they've been held in? Because more info continues to come out about that.
Yeah, so with every hostage release, we've heard more and more horrific stories over time of what these hostages are really facing during their time in captivity. We've seen a lot of reports of starvation, intentional starvation in order to manipulate, and not just during their time in captivity, but also right before their release. We know that when these hostages were released, that Hamas has actually, in some cases, drugged them. They have given them large amounts of food for several days prior to the release in order to keep up perceptions. I think that Hamas received a lot of criticism for the scenes that we were seeing, on the ground at the last hostage release, where these hostages came out looking like survivors. And I think that that is something that they wanted to avoid. I don't know if it was ever confirmed, but I do know that there were reports in the Arab media throughout the last week that, you mentioned Russia pressuring Hamas for the release of Sasha Trufanov. We were told at one point that Sasha Trufanov was not well enough to be released. So I think that all of these hostages, despite the fact that they may come out looking fairly healthy comparatively, are really dealing with unimaginable conditions, even physically, when it comes in. Of course, we've also heard more reports of the abuse that they suffered over time. Moran Stella Yanai is one of the hostages who was released fairly early on when it comes to this entire conflict, but she didn't speak about all the things that she experienced in captivity until Liri Albag was released. And the reason for that was that Liri actually intervened when Hamas was accusing Moran Stella Yanai of being an IDF soldier, which she was not. And they were torturing her in the presence of some of these other hostages. You've mentioned that the hostages who have returned have been able to give a sign of life to some of these families, really a desperate hope for some of these families who haven't heard anything from their families in quite some time. But this intervention from Liri, Moran Stella Yanai stated just a few weeks ago that she saved her life on the ground there in Gaza captivity. So we're getting more and more information every day about what's happening. I also want to note, I don't know if we have the footage yet, but we'll try to get it up for you shortly, that on this display, part of the stage that we've seen set up by Hamas, they actually put the picture of two different hostages who are still in captivity, Matan and Einav Zangauker, who are their photos on the stage, and with the depiction, time is running out. So even in the midst of these hostage release fiascos that we're seeing from Hamas, they're very, very committed to their propaganda message. And I think this says a lot about Hamas as an organization in Gaza, that they're not really concerned with the well-being of Gaza and the fact that most of Gaza is in complete rubble and in total disarray as a result of their terrorist actions. And despite that, their number one priority is propaganda, putting on a show, and quite frankly, psychological warfare. We have not gotten any updates yet in terms of the progression of the hostage release right now. We know that there has been a slight delay. We can see on the screen now that there are crowds gathering still in Khan Yunis. We see a lot of media reporting live on the ground inside of Khan Yunis. But I wanted to speak a little bit about Yair Horn, which is also a very bittersweet release today, as his brother is also in captivity and remaining in captivity. Shosh, what can you tell us about Yair?
Yeah, so Yair was taken hostage with his brother Eitan. Eitan was visiting, remember, October 7th was a joyous holiday of Simchat Torah here in Israel for the Jewish people around the world. His brother Eitan was visiting from Kfar Saba just to spend time with his brother on that holiday. The two of them were taken hostage, kidnapped from their home on Niroz. We have not received any sign of life from the two of them since. We also have not received a sign of life from Sagi Dekohen. And that is okay, because we've seen hostages walk out of Gaza that we have not received signs of life from. For example, Eli Sharabi, we never received a sign of life from him in Hamas captivity, but he did walk out on his own 2 feet last week, although he was in an emaciated state. Something interesting that I keep thinking about is with all of the pressure from the United States this week on Hamas, specifically Donald Trump, pressuring Hamas to release all hostages, this is the week that we see an American being released from Hamas captivity. Sagi Dekohen, his father was born in Connecticut. He has been advocating around the world to get his son out, 36 years old, Sagi Dekohen. We said before, he will be reunited in a hopefully a joyous, beautiful moment today at Reim with his family, hopefully with his wife there, who survived October 7th. Unclear if he even knows if they are alive. We've seen really sad moments that we can't even put into words. Last week, Eli Sharabi coming home, having no idea his entire family was murdered in their home, in their safe room. He left last week wanting to have that joyous return. You said Hamas forced him to say he was excited to see his family on stage during that handover, just to come back into Israeli territory. Although in the best case, his family was they were the ones telling him his family died. Instead of Hamas doing it, it was his family. So I think we can find silver linings in a lot of these if you want to look for them, and I think it's important.
Absolutely.
And also Or Levy learned last week when he came home, his wife Anav was also murdered in that death bomb shelter at the Nova Music Festival where Hirsch was taken from as well. And all of these people have their own stories. They're all walking out. Remember, they survived October 7th. They also have really no idea what happened with the state of Israel, the war Israel went through with Hezbollah. All of this time, so many historical events have happened, and they have no idea. This whole nation has been able to understand. Yet imagine coming back, and I keep using this analogy, as the worst time capsule of your whole life. You're stuck. You have no idea. All you know is October 7th and what you're dealing with for 500 days of conditions. You come out to relearn a whole new world, a whole new life of reality, of your family. And I think we need to continue to humanize these stories and make people remember that as us, as people, imagine putting yourself through all these moments and then coming out, seeing a brand new world. A lot of these guys have not even seen sunlight for 500 days. I mean, to think about that, it's emotional. I know it'll get more emotional today for this country, too.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, I think it's also important to know, just yesterday, I believe it was Noah Argamani, the former hostage that was rescued by IDF forces on the ground there in Gaza. She posted something on social media about how it's a very surreal experience to be coming back into Israeli society, which is your home, and feel like in her case, part of her is left behind in Gaza. You can't just undo or forget these horrific experiences that they had. And of course, in the case of Noah Argamani, as well as many other hostages that have been released in various stages of this whole war, they have loved ones who are still in captivity. Avi Natan, the boyfriend of Noah Argamani, is still there in captivity, not expected to be released during this phase of the hostage for ceasefire deal. And of course, we know also today, Yair Horn, his brother, is still in Hamas captivity, not expected to be released today. And this, of course, despite the fact that we saw the type of ultimatum from President Trump when he said he wants to see all hostages released. I think it's important to note, we're getting reports on the ground now that just in a matter of minutes, there should be the vehicle with the 3 hostages arriving to the site in Khan Yunis, where the exchange is supposed to take place. I want to talk about the Red Cross. While we're waiting for that, though, the Red Cross has received a lot of criticism throughout this war for their failure to transfer medication to the hostages, to receive signs of life from hostages. Really, they seem to have been unable to do anything on the ground to make any progress when it comes to dealing with this tragic hostage situation. And just a few days ago, we finally saw the Red Cross come forward and say that they're demanding to know more about the conditions of the hostages after the frightening sights that we saw last week with the release of Eli Sharabi and the other hostages. So I think the reaction from a lot of people, especially in Israel, is, well, where were they? 500 days too late. We're glad to see that the Red Cross is stepping up, but I think it's important to note that the Red Cross has actively taken part in these hostage releases. I mean, they were paraded on stage to sign release documents. I mean, whether they realize it or not, are being used as part of the propaganda in this entire scene of hostage release.
I think something to note here in Israel, there's a satirical joke going around that the Red Cross is actually just an Uber service to get these hostages from Gaza back into the hands of the IDF. I mean, if that is the only role that they're doing, it's hard to understand. It's hard to watch the complicity of them having to go up on stage. We've continued to mention that the Red Cross doesn't need to comply and sign documents. There were no documents during their kidnapping, right? There were no certifications signing over of let's transfer and kidnap people from Israel to Gaza. So the fact that there's this quote-unquote formal process, Hamas is making the world see this in a specific way and to make it seem as if the Red Cross really is working with them, and Red Cross is being thrown into this and doing so. And it's hard to watch because the Red Cross is such an international organization that is supposed to come to aid to people in situations like this. It's hard for the public here in Israel to see. We've continued to report that a lot of Israelis, when they hear that the hostages are being transferred from the Red Cross to Israel, a lot of them do not believe it. They don't believe the hostages are even coming home until the IDF confirms that they have the hostages in their own hands. There's so much distrust that has been created here in Israel when it comes to the Red Cross, because we've seen the complicity, the level of complicity that has been seen on stage. We will see today, unfortunately, the same thing. I also want to note, on stage on the ceremony, we've seen a timer, one of those timers, those sand timers that you flip over. It's been a sign and a symbol Hamas has used, and it's supposed to indicate, when time is slowly coming down, you see the sand coming down, and they have that on stage right now. They're using symbols. Remember, every one of our viewers needs to watch this ceremony with a lens on. Everything is curated, it's hand done, it's detailed on purpose, and I think that's important for our viewers to note when you watch this. Everything is specific, and we will see that today.
I think this is also part of the reason you see such a strong reaction from U.S. President Trump. For example, we saw a very harsh criticism of Hamas after the last hostage release. You could see even in the footage, I'm not even sure if we have it, but you could see in the footage of President Trump that he was shocked by the scenes that were coming out of Gaza. And I think if you look at the banners that have been printed for this event today by Hamas, you see one that is specifically addressed to President Trump, and that is the sign that says, I believe it is no immigration from Gaza. The only immigration will be to Jerusalem. Of course, this is their fantastical notion that they are going to overthrow the state of Israel and march to Jerusalem, I guess. This, of course, a direct response to President Trump's recent announcement that the U.S. will take over Gaza, in his words, that they will own Gaza, and his plan to, relocate up to 1.8, even 2 million Gazans. We see now in the footage, I'm not sure. Yeah, we see now in the footage that the Red Cross is arriving on site. We hear here in the hostage square in Tel Aviv that already people are cheering. We have not seen any sight of the hostages yet, but the loosely dubbed Uber service of the Red Cross has arrived on the ground on the scenes in Khan Yunis.
Yeah, we see one vehicle, we see a second vehicle arriving right now. People here in Hostage Square are cheering about this. Usually when the Red Cross also arrives in these vehicles, we see a caravan of Hamas pickup trucks and vehicles in tow. Right now we only see 2 white Red Cross vehicles. Unclear of which hostages are in each vehicle, if all 3 of them are in one, if it's 2 in one, and what the logistical operation is here with the Red Cross. We see one backing up into the space of where this ceremony Hamas is creating is about to take place. Usually when we see the Red Cross vehicles arrive within 2 to 5 minutes, then we see the hostages start to come out. So this is the protocol we continue to see. We
see a third vehicle from the Red Cross arriving now. From what I understand, the hostages are not yet in these vehicles. They will be transferred into Red Cross hands. It's being said now that Hamas will be bringing the hostages to the site in a matter of minutes. As I mentioned at the beginning, Hamas has reported that they will be arriving at the scene with the vehicle that these hostages were actually kidnapped in on October 7th, a vehicle that, of course, is Israeli, stolen from the ground in Israel. This was one of the tactics that the Hamas terrorists used on the ground on October 7th. We have not seen those scenes yet. Unclear if that will be broadcasted live or that will be something that Hamas puts together in propaganda footage that we have seen in every single release, all 6 of them so far. I guess this is the 6th, so all 5 of them so far. So we'll be watching for that. But you can see here the scenes, large crowds gathering in Khan Yunis as the now 3 vehicles have arrived at the site where the transfer is supposed to take place.
Yeah, as you can see, all these terrorists have completely covered their faces. You can barely see anything. They've always managed to make sure their identities are not known. You can see their weapons up in the air as they surround the vehicles. Like we said before, this is it's done to show that Hamas has a stronghold still in Gaza. A lot of times there's drone images, and once the drone zooms out, you can see actually how small the crowds are. But when zoomed in, it feels as if there really is is a large Hamas presence. Last week we saw the hostage release handover take place in Deir al-Bala, which is said to be a stronghold of where Hamas is in central Gaza. This, of course, is in a different city. Like we said, every single city has its own reasons for why there's a hostage release taking place there. Any ideas as to why this might be happening in Khan Yunis today?
I'm not sure about why Khan Yunis specifically, but I do think it's interesting to note that we see Palestinian Islamic Jihad and Hamas together. As I mentioned at the beginning, there were two separate locations in one of the previous releases. One of them was organized by Palestinian Islamic Jihad, one of them organized by Hamas. We have seen, I would say, I hesitate to even say this because it makes me feel a little bit sick to admit this, but a higher level of production when it comes to the scenes that are coming from Hamas. I think it's also important to note that we found out after the first few releases in this hostage deal we see now a reaction from some of the hostage families on the ground celebrating the fact that, you know, things are underway. We will continue to. There's no words to describe that. No words to describe that.
Remember, these families have fought for nearly 500 days to get their loved ones out. This is the first sign of life they're actually seeing. Even though they might not be there right now, they know that they're on the way there. And to them, just to even know that their loved one is on the way being transported to a spot, look, you see their reactions. They haven't even seen their loved one yet, but they know they're that close. It's almost like a victory for them, right? You see them wiping tears off their faces, their eyes, these large embraces. Family is really the foundation for so many here in Israel. And I think it's important for our viewers in the diaspora to understand that even though you might not be families with these hostages, there's a reason why Hostage Square is filled with people on Shabbat, the Sabbath here in Israel, when everyone wants to sleep in. There's hundreds of people that come out to support these families. We say that, you know, this is the soul of the nation. When one Israeli, when one Jew, when anyone part of the state of Israel bleeds, everyone feels that pain, that injury as well. On your screen right now, you'll see these big scores of Hamas terrorists and supporters around. Obviously, two very different images from Israel to Gaza of what's happening, right?
Absolutely. I mean, we see a large number of armed terrorists on the ground there. It looks like the events are somewhat underway based on what we're seeing from the scenes on the ground here in Khan Yunis. I was just going to mention earlier, before we saw the shots of the family being, you know, prepared to welcome back their loved ones, that these productions are actually being put together by I'm not sure if he's current but former Al Jazeera producer, and this has been a consistent problem between Hamas and Al Jazeera from the beginning of the war, that there were several different journalists or alleged journalists who also doubled as members of Hamas, some of whom are believed to have taken part in the actual October 7th massacre. And of course, we see that the production of this event, as I mentioned, on having hostages on stage to give speeches, this is something par for the course when it comes to the terrorist organization. As we're waiting for more updates from the scene here, as we see the crowds gathering in Khan Yunis, I wanted to discuss a little bit of, you know, the future of this hostage deal. We are still in phase one. There are more hostages set to be released in this stage, but we've heard no updates or no real progress in terms of negotiations. What do we know so far about stage two or even stage three of this event? Yeah, so there's a lot of speculation here in Israel if the government truly does want a phase two to happen, or if they want to resume or return to the fighting inside of Gaza. We know that there has been a team of negotiators sent to Doha, Qatar, to continue this negotiation for the phase two. So let's talk about who would be released in phase two, right? So this would include all male hostages under the age of 50 years old and all male soldiers. We know that there is one American-Israeli soldier that is still in Hamas captivity that would and could be released in phase two, which is Zidan Alexander from Tenafly, New Jersey. His grandmother here in Israel has been fighting like no other, a lioness herself, as his family says, to get him home. His family lives in New Jersey, as I said. Remember, this massacre on October 7th, this war has impacted people all across the world.
all three hostages coming out today are not just Israeli citizens. They hold citizenship in other countries. Sagid Khan is an American-Israeli. Sasha Trufanov is a Russian-Israeli. And we have Yair Horn, who is an Argentinian-Israeli. We have three different nations that are also tied into this. So remember, it's not just Israel, it's not just Hamas, it's the greater world that's really impacted by what happened. And unfortunately, a lot of families say at this point it feels as if having an additional citizenship might not even help the release. You have, an American coming out today after 500 days of Hamas captivity. There's question of how much does an American citizenship really help when it comes to being in a situation like this. And so there's just a lot of questions of when it comes to kidnappings and dealing with terrorist organizations, how much further can a world nation, world leaders really help facilitate the release? I mean, we have Russia that's been fighting for the release of their own people who has ties to Hamas, and finally, after 500 days, they're able to get one of those out, which is Sasha Trufanov. I want to say that Sasha Trufanov's girlfriend, Sapir, was also taken on October 7th. She was released in November of 2023. She has been fighting to get Sasha out. A lot of these people today, these families have experienced their own form of Hamas abuse. Like we said, Sasha's entire family was taken hostage except his father, who was killed on October 7th. The rest of his family was released in November of 2023. So they have a taste of what captivity is like, but not the full thing of 500 days of it.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, I think that we're going to see a big difference in terms of the recovery or rehabilitation, if rehabilitation is possible. As I mentioned, Noah Argamani said this morning, rehabilitation or a full rehabilitation is not possible. I mean, these hostages are forever changed by what we're seeing, but we're going to see a difference in the hostages who spent a month or two in Hamas captivity versus 16 months and counting. And of course, we've also seen a drastic difference in the way that male hostages were treated versus the female hostages. We, again, don't know all of the details of what happened. We know that there was some form of sexual assault during this time in captivity, but we don't know all the details of this. And I don't expect that we will know all the details in the long term when it comes to that. But we absolutely do know that there was intentional starvation, that there were physical beatings, that there was psychological torture in addition to that for nearly all, if not all, of these hostages. So extremely disturbing scenes that we're seeing. I also want to note one thing interesting about Sasha Trufanov, and that is that he actually was an employee of Amazon. Now, Amazon has faced a lot of pressure, both internally from other employees as well as from outside of Amazon in order to call for his release, in order to raise awareness. Now, unfortunately, Amazon has not done anything. They have not issued any sort of formal statement throughout this war. They also have, according to employees, they also have warned that the raising awareness on the ground within Amazon as a company, they didn't want hostage flyers hung in any of their offices to raise awareness about what was happening on the ground when it comes to Sasha. But hopefully we will see something today. Upon his release, we're hopeful that there will be an update from Amazon, because there's been a lot of criticism over the past year. I think justifiably so.
Definitely.
It's of course not their responsibility, but we would like to see more unison on this. And I do want to welcome to our broadcast now, Kalev and David. Thank you for joining us this morning. Good to have you here. Yeah, hopefully we have some good news and something to celebrate this morning, despite the bittersweet reality of, in the case of Yair Horn, his brother, still being left behind.
Right. I think this is a very significant day. First of all, given what happened this week, I think now one can be fairly confident, unless something totally unexpected happens, that we're going to come to the completion of what the phase one of the hostage deal. Because if there was going to be a blow-up, it was clear Hamas was perhaps looking to do so this week. And the pressure, particularly put on by President Trump and his reaction, I think sort of turned the tide and made it clear that we're going to get to this, at least to the beginnings of the so-called phase 2, which actually now officially is supposed to start in the coming weeks. So that's one thing. And the other thing is the three young men, those who have been reporting, as I'm sure you all have, know that the families of these three young men have been among the most prominent in terms of arguing their case, particularly, for example, Sagid Dechelchen, his father, Jonathan, who's an American immigrant to Israel and very articulate professor of history at Hebrew University, has been one of the most outspoken. So we all know about the stories of these young men, and certainly let's just hope we're going to know in the coming minutes when we see them what kind of condition they're going to be, and that's the big question.
I think that's what we're all looking out for. You know, as we watch these Red Cross vehicles here, Emily, you mentioned that Hamas will come in their own convoy behind the Red Cross. All eyes will be when those doors open, right? And to see their conditions. Last week, we had no idea the state of these three male hostages when those doors opened, and you saw the shadows of these men. Ohad Ben Ami was the first one to come out with these glasses on. He looked as if he hadn't seen the sun. He was being held up. His walk and his mannerism was very shaky. And you saw
all three hostages struggled to walk.
You saw Eli Sharabi. His face looked as if it was in skeletal mode. It was unbelievable to see. So what the three of us and what all of Israel will be looking at here is when those doors open, what will these men look like? We mentioned PIJ has released 2 propaganda videos of Sasha Trufanoff so far this morning, and he appears to be in okay state, but one of the families continues to say they might look okay from the outside, but the inside tells a completely different story. So even though the conditions might look okay for some, we know that it does not tell the story of what they're going through mentally and the traumas they've experienced.
I do want to say, looking at the scene, and even though apparently they're all three going to be released together there in Khan Yunis,
we do see movement now of the Red Cross vehicles.
Apparently arriving a little later than they were anticipated. They're saying there was a delay, at least a half an hour. One reason might be Khan Yunis, which unfortunately I know well because I did serve there in the army. It's, of course, a very crowded area. There's apparently been a lot of destruction in that area. It may have been more difficult for them to just arrive at that point. But we're looking at a scene. Apparently all three are going to be released. It looks pretty much under control. Perhaps Hamas, again, the criticism that they've gotten about some of the crowd scenes that we've seen, they maybe want to keep this under control. Apparently they're going to make, again, we're going to see that absurd ceremony in which they're going to make all three, this is what I've heard now just in the last few minutes, they're going to make all three
give speeches
and accept these
So we see now a vehicle, we see now one of the vehicles, I'm not sure, perhaps this is one of the vehicles that was stolen on October 7th, I'm not sure. They did say earlier that they were going to be arriving in a vehicle stolen on October 7th, that they actually kidnapped at least some of these hostages in.
Right, and that's
so we are looking,
Palestinian Islamic Jihad, I think.
We are looking for that. We see a group of Palestinian Islamic Jihad terrorists arriving now. There are crowds here in Tel Aviv in Hostage Square who are cheering already. We believe at least some of those hostages are in that white vehicle that we see arriving now.
Yes. And it's very possible for these hostages being released, they don't really know what's happening. We've heard reports that in captivity, these hostages were told they're going to be released, and then they end up not. So, you know, for example, when we saw the release of Gadi Moses and Arbel Yehud, they had no idea really what was going on, just these crowds swarming them. So, you know, these men might come to this ceremony having really no idea. Maybe they're being released, maybe they're not. So I think it's important to note that there's
I think we're going to see in just a moment some of the hostages exiting this vehicle. We will look as closely as we can to try to determine which of the hostages are there, as well as, of course, what their state is.
Right.
I think the whole country right now is standing on edge. A lot of anxiety,
100%.
A lot of anxiety in these moments for the entire country.
100%. And I do think, for example, Hamas absorbed some of the criticism that they had, and they would have been, you know, in terms of trying to make the presentation and trying to put the condition of the hostages in the best light. But as you said, Emily, we don't know the kind of abuse. Well, we do know in a sense because we started to heard, for example, Keith Siegel released this video just yesterday describing in detail some of the abuse that he suffered, mental abuse, physical abuse that he suffered during his captivity. So we understand now the conditions that some of these people have experienced, despite the fact that, as you said, on first glance, when we see them, they may appear to be at least in better relative condition than the hostages released last week.
The testimonies are really harrowing to hear. We've heard that some of these men have been tied upside down with their feet hanging from the ceiling, right, having items branded and burned on their bodies. We've heard they've been shackled for nearly their entire time in tunnels, having no access to the outside world. A lot of these hostages released, we've seen in the past, they at least were able to hear radio or TV of their families fighting for them and the protests that have happened in Israel, but we're hearing these men have been in a completely different world, locked away, tucked away, with no access to the reality of what's happening here.
We've also seen, of course, a great deal of psychological warfare. You know, we've seen that Daniela Giboa, for example, they made her stage her own death. Including in a video, it purposely highlighted her tattoo so that her body would be recognizable in propaganda footage. Just a totally depraved level of twisted psychological warfare that we've seen. In addition to that, we also know that today, Sagid Dekel Khan, his daughter Shacha, was born just a few months after he was taken captive. Certainly something to celebrate today, that for the first time he's going to see his daughter. However, it's also important to note that how did Hamas respond to this? They sent him a gift inside of Hamas captivity to celebrate the birth of his daughter. So it's just really twisted scenes. You know, any second now we expect to see some of the hostages in this vehicle, but God only knows what they've been going through. Even in the past week during this hostage deal, we know that they've changed some of their tactics just the last few days in order to present a little bit better look in terms of how these hostages were treated, especially after the criticism of what we saw last week.
But your point about the video that Danielle Giboa made raises a very important issue, Emily, which is we've got to be very cautious about, in terms of our thinking in making preliminary decisions about who may be alive or not, because there are people that is not.
We see now some movement.
These are the moments we really wait for here.
Right.
At Hostage Square, we hear the cheers, and we know to kind of pay attention to the screen.
So you
Something's
see the
happening.
Red Cross now.
Looks like there's a Al Jazeera reporter right there on your screen. You can see he has a microphone in his hand, wearing a blazer. That's really the only media that's allowed to be in there to watch this, to be part of it and to see it and to document it all. Here in Israel, we just have a live stream to depend on. We are depending on this live stream to see the life that is about to come out of Gaza. Remember, this hostage release has taught us there really is life in Gaza when it comes to Israeli hostages. We also saw, back to your point, Kalev,
we see now the Red Cross, we see now the Red Cross meeting with Hamas and Islamic Jihad, I believe. I think they will be signing something. Not sure yet if they will be on the actual stage. But we do see an interaction now between the terror groups and the Red Cross.
Right. They may be discussing that signing list, and this is an attempt by Hamas, propaganda to show them, to present themselves as
the door is open of the vehicle. Just want to update our viewers. I know we don't have that shot yet, but we are getting reports from the ground inside of Khan Yunis that the door for the hostages is open. Unclear what exactly is happening between the Red Cross and Hamas at the moment, but we do have confirmation that the hostages are there. Hopefully we will have footage very shortly of that.
Right, and as I said, the Red Cross, this is an attempt by Hamas to present themselves still as the governing force in Gaza, to attempt to give themselves some kind of legitimacy. And the Red Cross, unfortunately, going along with this kind of performance, under circumstances you understand why, but it's part of the overall approach of the Red Cross that has been criticized.
See the Red Cross walking over to greet the hostages right now. They are interacting with, unclear if all the hostages are in that vehicle, but we do see the Red Cross now interacting with the hostages.
photos being taken of them. Remember, there are cameras all over surrounding this ceremony of Hamas trying to document it. You know, brings into question, number one, why? Number two, how do they have all this equipment? And number three, you can see the Red Cross now on stage.
Right, this is the signing ceremony that
we see the Red Cross, an international humanitarian organization, taking part in a terrorist organization's propaganda campaign on stage, signing paperwork for the release of hostages.
Again, this is part of the criticism of the Red Cross, the way they've handled it, the way they have not been able, that they have not more forcefully demanded, at least certainly publicly, access to the hostages.
I just want to note one thing. I mentioned earlier in the broadcast that there was a picture of two of the hostages who are still there, Matan and Einav, in the table where they are signing these documents. You can see that those little images right there, it's not a huge banner, the little images are of those two hostages right in front of the Red Cross signing the documents. Unbelievable scenes. And the text there that is written in Hebrew, Arabic, and English says time is running out. So even in the midst of this, they are using the Red Cross as a propaganda campaign in order to apply pressure to the state of Israel, to the international community. Absolutely.
As an instrument, they're using the Red Cross as an instrument of their psychological warfare against Israel.
We've reported just the distrust people in Israel have when it comes to the Red Cross. Seeing this right now in Hostage Square, you can hear them booing this Red Cross volunteer or employee on stage right now, saying shame, because once again, the distrust, being complicit in a ceremony like this. We see the two of them standing up. It seems as if that documentation signing is now completed. This is the moment we've been waiting for right now. This is it. Of these hostages about to come out. We see this Hamas senior official, a commander of some sort, going over to one of the vehicles at this moment. The doors are open. Any moment we're about to see one hostage come out. We're hoping they are on their own 2 feet.
I just want to remind our viewers, if you're watching the scenes now, if you're seeing this footage from on the ground in Khan Yunis, it's important to note that you see all around these hostages are armed terrorists. In addition to that, the only other thing we really see are cameras. This is a huge production on the ground in Gaza. This is all part of Hamas's propaganda campaign in order to display themselves as being some sort of legitimate leadership in Gaza. Of course, this is something that we've seen even in recent days. President Trump, U.S. President Trump, strongly reject when it comes to Hamas. The new administration has been very, very firm that Hamas will not have a future in the Gaza Strip. Let's hope that that continues given these scenes. We do see some movement now surrounding the vehicle. Of course, you see armed terrorists, both Palestinian Islamic Jihad and Hamas, 360 degrees.
Here we go. Yep.
There's Sasha.
Sasha Trufanov, yes, and it looks relatively in good condition as a physical condition.
Remember, he was held by Palestinian Islamic Jihad. He's the first one to come out of this vehicle.
Once again, we see a goodie bag being handed to these hostages.
Yes, Sagi Dekolchen.
Now, Sasha again is and we hear cheers here in Tel Aviv.
Horn. All three hostages are standing on their feet right now.
Right. Horn looks thinner than when he went, and notably.
Yeah, but all three hostages are able to walk.
Crowd cheering here.
Being welcomed by cheers here on the ground in Tel Aviv.
The crowd is cheering here at Hostage Square.
Let's put into perspective what this means for people. You know, all three of us have a smile on our face because after 500 days, we see these people walking on their feet. We have no idea what they went through. We can only imagine the emotions their families are experiencing right now.
Now the hostages now being taken onto the stage. We'll have to see if they will be asked to speak. We know that Hamas was planning on that. Remains to be seen if that will actually take place.
Right. No, apparently they are. They were reporting that they're all going to be, 3 of them will be made to speak. We'll see. Well, this is a big moment.
We see the 3 hostages on stage, flanked on every side by armed terrorists.
There's Yair Horn on the left. You have Sagi Dekolchen in the middle, Sasha Trufanov on the right. This is the 3 male hostages released this Saturday. This is them. They're standing on their own 2 feet. You mentioned that Yair Horn looks thinner than what he
does look. Let's keep in mind, all 3 of these men have a citizenship other than Israel.
We see some of the families here.
Right, the reactions.
First sight of their loved ones.
Absolutely. That may have been impacted in how they were treated by their captors.
Sasha is about to speak. Sorry, I just want to...
Okay, so go ahead.
So now we do see that Sasha Trufanov is speaking on the stage.
So Sagi Dekolchen with the microphone in his hand right now.
We should mention they're reading off a script basically prepared by Hamas, and the Israeli networks do not necessarily carry this. It's definitely going to be seen as propaganda, so that's why we're not
As I mentioned to our viewers, I think we will not actually be airing these actual speeches.
Right.
Again, this is part of the propaganda. The families, in some cases, have actually requested not to broadcast this type of footage. But as I mentioned last week, when we saw with the release of Eli Sharabi, they specifically asked him to speak about his family that they had murdered. So this is a really twisted psychological warfare game we see happening now.
Sagi Dekolchen is holding some type of memento that Hamas thinks is a memento in his hand. And now we have Yair Horn.
Yair Horn.
Definitely looking a lot thinner than what he was going into Hamas captivity. Remember, his brother Eitan is still in Hamas captivity. Unclear if they were held together, and if they were, what that part was like.
Unfortunately, maybe we'll get some clarification in the coming hours. We don't know that for sure, though. Obviously raises some concerns about Eitan.
Unbelievable.
So we do see Yair Horn on stage speaking now. And on the other side, we see the reactions of the families watching their loved ones, unfortunately being paraded across the stage, but as the final hurrah for Hamas. Soon these hostages will be home, reunited with their loved ones.
What's next is they will be transferred to the hands of the IDF by the Red Cross. They'll be taken to Reim military base for initial checkups where they'll reunite with their families. And then after that, they'll be taken by helicopter either to Swarovski or Sheba medical centers here in central Israel. This is a moment they're so close to freedom. Hopefully they know that. We know that. You know, that's what's hard looking difficult watching this is we know what's next for them. Do they know what's next for themselves?
I think
it's a bittersweet moment because it's watching the spectacle by Hamas is very difficult certainly for Israelis to stomach. On the other hand, this is the price to get these 3 young men back. This has been the price of the deal. And you could only put yourself in the minds of the families and seeing their loved ones, their first glimpse of their loved ones after so long. This is part of the reality of what we're experiencing now.
And we see the armed terrorists behind him.
I believe that's Jonathan Dekolchen now on the screen, the father of Sagi. And I've spoken to him several times. Again, an American immigrant to Israel, a professor. He's been a very eloquent spokesperson for the plight of the hostages. I just, on an emotional level, feeling as a father what he must be feeling now to see his son and the father of his grandchildren coming back home. It's hard to put into words.
So a lot of the weapons that we're seeing in the hands of these terrorists now are actually Israeli weapons. These are weapons that were taken by Hamas in the October 7th massacre. Of course, this is intentional. We see now the hostages being used to pose for photos. I believe he's actually holding the sign of the 2 hostages where it says they're running out of time, Matan and Einab that I mentioned. So again, we see this really, really twisted psychological warfare being used not only against the hostages who are being released today, but against the entire state of Israel. I mean, everyone who is awake now in the state of Israel, despite the fact it's a weekend and it's Shabbat, I think we're glued to the televisions watching the return of these these poor hostages.
Right, and packed now here in Hostage Square, packed here.
Wow, remember, it's Shabbat. It's the Sabbath here in Israel. Everything's pretty much closed.
Right,
and
looks like they're getting to the Red Cross
being
vehicles.
transported, I believe, to the Red Cross
Yes.
now, while the other 2 hostages remain on stage.
Let's talk about what he's wearing. This is a jumpsuit he's wearing. Remember, we wanted to talk about the outfits they're wearing because very specific. Last week we saw Orlevi dressed in a military outfit of some sort. Doesn't seem like any of these men are wearing that today. Seems like regular clothing. Taken into the Red Cross vehicle. That's first hostage to go in there.
So I believe Yair Horn has been transferred into Red Cross hands. So we will have 2 more hostages to do this walk, surrounded unfortunately by the production being put on by Hamas. But so far, one of them has been safely transferred into Red Cross hands. I was going to say it's been a relief to see that these hostages are at least able to walk after the horrific scenes that we saw last week. So at least this.
Absolutely.
At least
they do appear at least in better physical condition.
Yeah. Although Yair looks almost, half of his body weight, but able to walk, able to move. Sagid Dekelchen now making the transfer into Red Cross hands. This is an American-Israeli citizen.
He is so close to reuniting with his 3 daughters. He had 2 daughters when he went into captivity. He has 3. Life is so important to the Jewish people. For him to come home knowing there's an extra life he's about to embrace. I can't imagine the moments.
And for his community, apparently also he saved many people on the kibbutz.
Yep.
He was one of the first to send out an alert to kibbutz members on his phone, or sort of a WhatsApp to kibbutz members saying there's an attack underway, and that enabled several members of the kibbutz to seek safety.
Right.
So he's credited with saving a lot of the lives.
Not only that, he confronted terrorists in kibbutz near Oz, and then he was taken. His wife, 7 months pregnant at the time, was able to protect her and her soon-to-be child and 2 other children in their safe room. They survived, and this is a moment that is incredible.
There he goes. Yes.
Now we see Sasha Trufanov.
His family's waiting for him. His mother, grandmother, and girlfriend Sapir were all taken hostage on October 7th, released in November of 2023.
He looks incredibly overwhelmed.
Yes.
Making his way over to the Red Cross. After almost 500 days, Sasha Trufanov returns home.
There's been a lot of focus on him as both the fact that he has Russian citizenship. Let's keep in mind Russia hosting Hamas officials with honor in Moscow while one of their citizens is being held hostage, and also as an employee of Amazon. And there's been a lot of questions raised about how the company was involved.
Or not involved.
Or not involved.
That's right.
In raising the profile of his particular case. So Sasha Trufanov, there's been a lot of focus on him. A lot of issues raised by his
It's unclear if he knows his father was murdered on October 7th. He will be going home and not be able to feel that embrace, but he will have the embrace of his other family.
As well as his partner.
His partner.
He's also been very high profile in terms
Something I want to highlight about his mother, she actually became religious during this time once she returned home. And she actually was brought to Reim yesterday to make sure she was there before Shabbat to greet and to reunite with him. She made sure to say last night before Shabbat started, everyone light Shabbat candles and make sure you're making a wish for all of the rest of the hostages to come home. We've heard stories of this.
they're on their way.
The Red Cross vehicles are on their way. Hostages will soon be transferred into IDF hands. We hear cheers already here in Tel Aviv in Hostage Square with a large crowd that's gathered to watch the return of our 3 hostages today.
Certainly this is a joyous moment. But there is another side of this, which I think is important to point out. Over 300 Palestinian prisoners, actually the largest release. So they're on their way home. But over 300 Palestinian prisoners being released.
Convicted terrorists.
Convicted terrorists.
That's right.
Today, the largest release. 2 of them directly involved. We're sitting here in Hostage Square in front of the Tel Aviv Museum. right across, about 10 minutes away, is the Sarona Market. Two of the hostages being released today were directly involved in planning and carrying out terrorists. I'm so sorry. Two of the terrorists being released today. One of them, the uncle of Marwan Barghouti, the arch-terrorist, Ahmed Barghouti, is being released today, directly involved in that 2016 attack on the Sarona Market, which took place just 10 minutes from here. 4 Israelis killed. Yeah. So a heavy price being paid.
And it's also important to know when it comes to Ahmed, I believe his name is Ahmed Barghouti,
yes,
he has been convicted of 13 life sentences.
Absolutely.
I mean, we're talking about a major terrorist figure who's being released today because for the people of Israel and the state of Israel, there is no price too high. You know, the state of Israel really will do anything to get these hostages back, despite whatever criticism, you know, may come. And of course, there's a diversity of opinions in the state of Israel, but the priority is getting these hostages
home.
Just
this week, I actually spoke with a family member whose uncle in 1996 as an IDF soldier was kidnapped and murdered by terrorists. His terrorist is set to be possibly released in this deal. He told me, this family member told me, it is frustrating that Hamas is pitting the pain of Israeli families against each other, of these hostage families, of the families who have lost their loved ones in terrorist attacks. There's a lot of pain in Israel, and they say that there shouldn't be compared, but they're both having to relive traumas in a lot of ways when it comes to these prisoner releases as well. So it's important to note that there are so many families tied into this, not just the hostage families, but the families of those impacted by the terrorists that are being released today and possibly in the future in exchange for this deal.
Again, they're repeating these pictures we saw from a few minutes ago, this release, and the joy in Hostage Square, the chance of Akshav for them to continue on. But yes, we have to keep in mind those families who have loved ones that were killed by some of the terrorists that are being released now. And we have to have sensitivity to their feelings about what's happening today, just as we, as journalists, have had that sensitivity to the feelings of the hostage families.
Absolutely.
I think it's also important to note the international impact of this. I mean, all 3 of the hostages we're seeing released today have foreign nationality. You know, they're citizens of other countries as well. And there were dozens of countries, citizens of dozens of countries who were kidnapped on October 7th. I mean, this is not just an Israeli issue. It's not just a Jewish issue. It's an international issue. And we see this, you know, oftentimes when it comes to hostage taking. Of course, we have another Israeli citizen being held in Iraq. There are countless hostages for various nationalities being held in Islamic Republic of Iran. So this is a global problem, this hostage diplomacy issue. And today we, of course, have Sasha, Russian-Israeli citizen. We have Yair Horn, who is an Argentinian Israeli citizen. And we have Sagid Zakelkhan, who is an American Israeli citizen. And there were various levels of involvement from all of these countries when it comes to negotiating their release. But unfortunately, it wasn't able to happen until today. But we are watching closely for the reports and the footage that we get from when they will be transferred any minute now into IDF hands.
Yeah, they'll be going to Reim military base with the IDF. They'll be getting their initial checkups there. They'll be able to change their clothing. What we've seen in previous releases is some of these hostages deciding to drape the Israeli flag around them once they get to Reim, as they reunite with their families. That's where these emotional videos will come out. We see those big embraces, those tears, people falling to the floor when they finally touch their loved one after 500 days of Hamas captivity. These are the moments that in Israel a lot of people wait for, because this is the moment that it's done. Their nightmare is done. But a lot of these hostages that have come out of Hamas captivity have said it's not done until the rest are out, because they know what it's like to be trapped in tunnels, chained, shackled, not having any food. And so hopefully these 3 hostages coming out today will also be able to give more families a sign of life. Like we've said, we've seen 10 signs of life these families have received since the last 3 male hostages were released.
Shows a good point, and I think it's not coincidental, because I think what's happening as we're moving away, we're almost done now with what's called phase 1. We are expecting 3 more next Saturday. The Trump administration and President Trump has been pressuring Hamas to try to speed up, release as many of the hostages now. We almost didn't get to this point. Hamas, again, trying to, in a sense, complicate the deal, made these false accusations this week saying Israel wasn't supplying its humanitarian aid under the deal, in a rare instance of the United Nations actually supporting it. How often does that happen?
Not only the United Nations as well as Egypt, both issued statements.
Saying that Israel was meeting its obligations under the agreement this week in providing humanitarian aid to Gaza Strip. And that's been very controversial among the people of Israel, especially after how we saw the condition of those 3 hostages last week. None of that humanitarian aid was reaching those hostages that we saw released last week. So the UN, Egypt, as you say, supporting Israel and saying they were meeting its obligations. President Trump putting tremendous pressure on Hamas, saying if the releases did not happen by noon today, there would be hell to pay.
Well, not only that, President Trump, of course, also noted that he wanted all hostages released, which is interesting. Last night we saw, after the list was released by Hamas, we saw the Prime Minister's office making a statement stating that they accepted the list, and then they reversed and said they didn't accept but they received. So it's a little bit murky exactly what Israel was expecting today. It will be very interesting to see what the reaction is of President Trump to this release. I know that he himself was quite disturbed by the physical scenes of the hostages last week. They do look better this week. It will be interesting to see how the president responds.
He did make a statement last night in Washington where he said that Israel, he would have preferred, or he would have done differently. He would have perhaps gone back to military action, but it's up to Israel to decide. That's a pretty big important point. President Trump, though he is talking about hell to pay, has now made it pretty clear it's not going to be the United States. If there is, he's going to give the green light to Israel to carry on the fight against Hamas without the restrictions that the Biden administration put on it. And we also did see very significant approval of a further military package of weapons that apparently had been held up by the Biden administration this week. So that's how that sort of clarified what President Trump was talking about. He doesn't want to commit U.S. forces or troops to the battle in Gaza, but he would give Israel a go-ahead without any of the sort of restrictions of the Biden administration. So that was the pressure that was put on Hamas as it led to this. But of course, now we're getting into the phase 2 of the deal. Those talks supposedly going to start this week officially with a delegation. Again, Emily, the government has been back and forth on, are they sending a delegation to Qatar? Are they not sending a delegation? What's going to be their mandate? A lot of things happening out of the eye of the public and the media. Even we're getting a lot of mixed signals. We don't even know to this point what messages were actually exchanged. For example, from the United States via Qatar to Hamas to reach the point we reached just right now.
What we know is that a total of 33 hostages are and continue to be released in this first phase of the deal. As of today, we have, before this release, we had 16 hostages. Now we have 19 Israeli hostages that have come out. We were told by officials at one point there were 8 bodies that were going to come out of the first phase. Now I believe it's been updated to 9 bodies. Just this week we had news that one of the oldest hostages in Hamas captivity, Shlomo Mansour, a Holocaust survivor, was declared dead in Hamas captivity. He was taken from kibbutz Kisufim. That was also part of the news this week. So his body is still in Gaza at this time. So we have more Israeli hostages set to come out next week as well. And then we'll get to the talking points.
Again, I hate to speculate because, again, we're getting into all kind of speculation. I think, though, in the general impression is that there'll be 2 more tranches. Like, basically, phase 1 will go on for 2 more weeks. And unfortunately, nothing has been 100% confirmed, but that last tranche would be for 2 weeks from now. We will be seeing remains of hostages being returned. That's going to be very difficult. Israelis are going to have to deal with them. Let's be so grateful today we saw 3 young, healthy men. Let me take that back.
Comparatively
compared to what we, for example, saw last week, walk out on their own 2 feet. It's not clear going forward if that's going to be the case.
So we have an update that just in a number of minutes, the hostages will be in IDF custody. We know that the helicopters have already arrived at Re'im base. Shosh, can you tell us a little bit about what we expect to see in the next hour or so? What's the plan for these hostages? What's the procedure that they're going to go through?
Yeah, so during this time, this is when people start to leave Hostage Square because they're waiting to go home to see the videos on their phones of the reunifications we're about to see. Step one is, we're actually hearing the announcement right now. We're waiting to hear. They're probably about to be in the hands of the IDF.
Just a few more minutes, they'll be in IDF hands.
Right, still in the Gaza area.
Correct.
But the transfer will be made, and then the Army will take them out.
So they'll be going
less than 10 minutes.
Less than 10 minutes, they'll be going into the hands of the IDF in Gaza, taken to Re'im military base. They will have initial checkups there. They will change their clothes. They will reunite with specific family members. They'll go to the hospitals, as we said, Swarovski or Sheba medical centers in central Israel to reunite with the rest of their families. So we are waiting for those moments to happen. But this, I guess you can say, is the exciting part of what's to come, to see those faces finally see their loved ones after 500 days. A lot of people have used the analogy of them coming back from the dead. A lot of these hostages have even said they've been reborn on these days, saying it's their second birthday. And I think it has a lot of significance to them that it's on Shabbat, which is a very holy day here in Israel. They call it
I also want to
rebirth.
know, just in terms of even the weather, you know, when we started this broadcast, of course, it's morning here in Israel, but almost the second that the hostages came out, I don't know if you noticed, the sun came out.
This is what happens.
2 weeks ago,
The same thing happened.
Yeah.
Last week as well. We've been reporting on this for 6 straight weeks of these hostages coming out, and you can actually feel the nature working with it at the same time, and it's incredible to see. But I think what's to come is the wonderful reunifications we're about to see. We said Sagid Khan will see his newborn, I guess 1-year-old child at this point for the very first time. He has no idea his family survived. So to come home to that, can you imagine the embraces as a parent, as a brother, a sister, an aunt, an uncle, a cousin, whoever you are, this is your loved one coming home. And it's a beautiful thing to see life coming out of Gaza after this long.
You know, we know Steve Witkoff, the U.S. envoy, is actually going to be coming to the area.
Right.
What do we know about the Trump administration? Has there been any formal response yet? I haven't received any updates. Maybe you guys have, in terms of the response from the Trump administration. What can we expect to see from Witkoff as well on the ground?
Right. So in terms of the messages, there have been kind of mixed messages, and kind of like an idea of a strategy is emerging. I would say, I don't want to call it good cop, bad cop, but clearly President Trump's public statements seem designed to put pressure not just on Hamas, as we saw this week for sure, but also the Arab nations that are involved in deciding perhaps what the future of Gaza will be, particularly Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and the Emirates. We saw President Trump's, of course, earlier statements about evacuating Gazans from the Gaza Strip, for example, to Egypt and Jordan. Egypt and Jordan have both publicly said that they're not going to take in the Gazans, and we saw that even King Abdullah of Jordan, after meeting with President Trump this week, had the government released a statement after that. But it looks like there is a sort of strategy emerging, which is trying to get these Arab nations to be more actively involved in at least taking temporary custodianship of Gaza, and maybe crucially contributing security forces that would take control of Gaza away from Hamas. So that seems to be the emerging strategy involved here. Steve Witkoff, and now even there is talk, and President Trump, one of the most intriguing things, saying that he's planning a trip to Saudi Arabia to perhaps discuss the future of Ukraine with President Putin. But of course, if he goes to Saudi Arabia, clearly that would also involve making some decisions about Gaza. A key date we're looking forward to, which will be February 27th, a meeting of the Arab League, and they're promising to present their plan their Gaza plan as an alternative to President Trump's plan to transfer Gazans out. Their alternative, we'll have to see what they come up with, whether the pressure of the administration will force them to make steps they have been reluctant to take in the past.
I just want to point out on the TV now, we see the footage of at least one of the families having a first interaction with the hostage. We do not have the sound footage, so I can't tell you what they're saying just yet. But obviously, we can see the joy on their faces as they hear the updates for the first time, hear the sound of their loved ones' voices. Here we go, some of the footage.
Right, speaking on phone, because we know that while they're in the Red Cross vehicles, they have been able, freed hostages have been able to
communicate.
It's
incredible.
With their families by phone.
Remember, they're hearing their voice for the first time in 500 days. It's unbelievable. Can you imagine if your family member was trapped in a terrorist organization's hands for that long, and then you hear their voice for the first time in 500 days. It's unbelievable. I want to go back to the Trump administration for one moment. I believe it, and I think from what we've seen, the Trump administration's priority has been working to get hostages and wrongfully imprisoned people out of the hands of people. For example, just this week, we saw one of an American coming out of Russia this week. The Trump administration secured that release. He was falsely imprisoned for having marijuana on him for medicinal purposes. He came home after years of being in Russia's prison system. And then, of course, we know that so many of these hostages have credited Steve Witkoff for getting this deal secured. Keith Siegel released his first ever statement video yesterday, thanking President Trump for helping him get out of Hamas captivity and helping facilitate this deal. A lot of these families who lived in the south of Israel. Looks like we're getting some news here in Hostage Square.
So the 3 hostages have been transferred into IDF hands. It is official. All 3 of them are safely with IDF forces being transferred to Re'im base. Very, very, very happy news. We hear cheers here in Tel Aviv in Hostage Square. A moment of relief.
A big moment. It's a huge moment for them to be in Israeli hands, in the hands of the IDF.
Remember, they have either been locked in tunnels or have heard the gunfights and the war going on, right? We know that a lot of hostages have experienced this war themselves, but not really understanding the gravity of what's happening in the north with Hezbollah and here with Hamas. A war started after this, and now they're leaving this hellish world that they were forced to be part of as civilians, as innocent people dragged into Gaza. Like you said today, Emily, one of the vehicles they were transferred in by Hamas was a vehicle they stole on October 7th. The last bit of torture that Hamas can put on these people.
We see cheering, clapping, celebrations from the families of the hostages. Incredible moment. Incredible. And just for our viewers now, the family that you're seeing now is the family of the American-Israeli, now former hostage, Sagi Dekelchen.
Really, having spoken with Sagi's father, Jonathan, several times, it's for me an emotional moment as a father. He's been quite outspoken. He's been quite critical of the government's handling of the hostage issue. It hasn't been a difficult road for him. He's gotten some criticism of that in response. So, but he's conducted himself with tremendous grace under pressure, Jonathan, during this whole ordeal. It's impossible. You said, can you imagine? I can't imagine as a father what he was.
Right, Connecticut-born, his father in the United States had a way of using his words to cut to the heart of Americans who might not really understand this. And that's the point of this hostage crisis, is how can you get people around the world to care about your loved one being in the hands of Hamas? You make them real people. These are real human beings, innocent lives taken. They had jobs. They worked at Amazon. They worked in their kibbutz machine shop. These are people that had children who had a life that was completely stolen from them. uprooted, and now they have a brand new reality. You mentioned Noah Argamani. Do you ever return to normal after 500 days of Hamas captivity? There's so many mental, psychological aspects to all of this. Yes, their body is physically inside of Israel, but their mind has been stuck in a world that you cannot imagine. We know that Gadi Moses and Keith Siegel used something called positive psychology to help them get through these moments. Gadi Moses walked in his little room about 4 kilometers every single day to keep his mind and his body active. Keith Siegel would close his eyes and imagine conversations with his loved ones, talking to them about happy moments, moments that he wanted to have in the future. They did everything they could to survive this. They survived. They are here now. They're back in the hands of the IDF on their way back to Israel.
It's also important to note that these hostages, in many cases, while they were in captivity, were unable to move for sometimes months at a time. What we know so far from the reports coming back is that they were chained for months at a time, various hostages in various locations, particularly in the underground tunnels. So really horrendous conditions. I know with the hostage release last week, they had to move them from the location a few weeks earlier because some of the hostages couldn't physically walk. They had been chained for so long. So appalling scenes. And of course, you mentioned earlier in the broadcast, Alon, the sign of life that his family did receive, was also a report about how he is physically chained for months at a time. So very difficult conditions they're coming back from.
With an eye injury. And remember, this list, these 33 hostages are said to have, quote, they're part of a humanitarian list. Unclear why it's humanitarian when all of these hostages are, but this prioritized people who were elderly, who were women and children, who were injured. Alon Ohel, we know, has an injury. We do know that Sasha went into Hamas captivity bloody. He had an injury on that day. Further released, unclear why, but in good news, probably because Russia helped push for his release. We do know that Hamas continues to violate this ceasefire agreement. Number one, why? Because there's Shiri Bibas, Kafir and Ariel, children still in Hamas captivity. Remember, they were supposed to be released in the first wave 6 weeks ago. There has been no indication of where they are, why they have not come out, as their father, Yarden Bibas, was released from Hamas captivity 2 weeks ago, looking visibly thin and not being able to have that reunification with his 2 young children and his wife Shiri. Unclear their status. Israel has demanded to know where they are, why they haven't come out, what their condition is. Still no answers. Hamas has violated the ceasefire agreement by not releasing them first.
You know, you mentioned at the beginning of the broadcast that we've had a very dramatic week in terms of will this deal happen, will it not happen, will there be a release, will there not? But even further than that, when it comes to just the ceasefire on the ground, you know, in the last 24 hours, we saw a rocket be fired at Israeli targets from Gaza. It actually fell short and landed inside of Gaza and killed a Palestinian. And bizarrely,
and not for the first time.
Exactly.
It's happened many times.
Yeah, they say at least 1/3 of all the rockets that have been fired by Hamas and other terror groups in Gaza have actually fell short and injured or killed Palestinians. Of course, one of the most famous cases towards the beginning of the war, the Al-Athi hospital bombing, where it was a misfired Islamic Jihad rocket that ended up hitting the parking lot of a hospital there in Gaza and injuring or killing between 40 and 50 people, which was erroneously reported internationally as being an Israeli airstrike, of course, which was not the truth.
Yeah, and I think that was the moment in this whole war that created the mistrust in media. We had outlets around the world jumping to report that Israel was the one that bombed and struck this hospital. It turns out that it was Palestinian Islamic Jihad firing something that went in the wrong direction, killing their own. And it's important to continue to highlight that as reporters on the ground here in Israel, we have a clear understanding of what this is. We understand why these people come here to support these families. They have no idea who they are. We understand what this country prioritizes and the different sides of this deal, right? People who don't necessarily want the hostages released because they see the security problem in the future with these terrorists released. I mentioned before, I spoke with the family family.
Well, I'm not sure that anybody doesn't want the hostages released, but of course the price is very high.
And that is going to be the dilemma, especially now that's going to kick in this week as we start the phase 2 negotiations. And I said before, Hamas is playing a psychological game, is waging its psychological warfare. What is releasing these signs of life? Just the condition of the hostages, reports coming, and it's sort of facing the dilemma of Israel weighing getting out these hostages. Some of these hostages now, but there's a chance they're still alive. Again, creating a situation where Hamas will still be in power in Gaza or in a position to carry out these kind of terror attacks. And everything we talk about.
We see sorry, just to cut you off, I want to point out for our viewers, we see the footage now of the hostages in Israeli territory. Huge sigh of relief collectively in the state of Israel. The hostages will be driving by that point where we have the shot right now coming through on their way back to Re'im base.
We're going to have to weigh these kind of scenes to possible concessions in the talks going ahead. You mentioned the media, the role of the media. You mentioned earlier, Emily, Al Jazeera, which has been functioned almost as a propaganda arm of Hamas during this. And of course, when we talk about Al Jazeera, we're talking about Qatar. Qatar is playing a key role in this situation up to this point, and the question is how much of a role are they going to be given? And that's been a subject that we won't have to go into all the details of big debate, political debate in Israel this week, when we've learned more about the efforts that Qatar has tried to make to, in a sense, have its agents spread propaganda, playing a positive role when we know, in fact, through its agents such as Qatar, it's playing such a negative role.
Of course. I think we might have a slight problem with your mic, Kalev, but I do want to pick up on what you were saying in regards to Qatar and their role in this conflict. They are playing the mediator. At the same time, they are actively involved in supporting Hamas. Of course, they have been one of the headquarters of Hamas leaders even prior to October 7th. So they really have been playing both sides. And of course, as I mentioned before, Al Jazeera. This is Qatari state media. This is something, a news organization that has been actively used to promote terrorism long prior to October 7th. I mean, Al Jazeera Arabic, they threw a birthday party on air for a Hezbollah leader. So it frankly isn't that surprising to see that one of the senior producers of Al Jazeera is putting together this whole Hamas production with the stage, with the Red Cross going on stage. And of course, the other scenes that we saw on October 7th when it comes to the involvement of Al Jazeera reporters, photographers who were involved in the actual massacre. A very disturbing, as a journalist, a very disturbing scene to deal with. Of course, we want to be reporting the news, but not making the news.
And how much has Al Jazeera been, in a sense, a kind of propaganda arm of Hamas? Consider that not just did Israel close their bureau here in Jerusalem, but the Palestinian Authority closed the Hamas bureau in
most
the
of
Al
the Arab
Jazeera,
world, in fact.
Yes, closed the Al Jazeera bureau in Ramallah because they saw them basically acting as a propaganda arm of Hamas. And that is something that has to be reckoned with going forward in terms of the role that Qatar is going to have in the phase 2 negotiations and the eventual fate of what happens with the Gaza Strip.
Now, we see the hostages. They are about to be transferred into Re'im base if they are not already there. But after that, they will be transferred to medical facilities. What do we know about what tests they're going to undergo? What kind of treatment are they going to receive?
Yeah, so, of course, one thing they worry about is how much have these hostages have they been able to eat, right, in captivity. Unfortunately, the history of the Jewish people comes back into play here. When Holocaust survivors were released and they were liberated from camps, a lot of them ate so much food, it impacted their health going forward, or they they tragically pass because they didn't have any food. The same thing happens here, where medical officials worry about their intake right away. They usually give them some type of pill to help in terms of digestive, what they can eat. We've seen some hostages coming out saying, I want a beer. They want bamba and a beer. They say that needs to wait because they need to be able to monitor what they can eat, take things in very slowly. We know that they're given tea and a certain type of cracker when they first arrive at Reim military base. So very selective food that they do eat at first, because we don't know what they were able to eat in captivity, and they can't just eat everything that they want to eat at one time. Of course, part of the process is reuniting with their families at the hospitals. Usually their extended family is located there. When they get to Reim as their first stop, they'll reunite with either 2 or 3 family members, sometimes 1. The rest of their family is waiting for them at the hospitals. When they're being transported from Reim to the hospitals by helicopter, it's amazing to see that Israel's Air Force gives them these whiteboards where they're able to write a message, which has been so interesting to see. And every single one of them has had their own message. One of them just put a heart. One of them said, thank you to all of Israel for helping fight my release. Some of them said, I'm reborn again, right? So that's really our first sign of seeing how they are mentally, seeing what their state is at that point. And then they'll be at the hospital where they'll receive initial checks. Last week we saw medical officials say right away how emaciated these men are, how they've received no nutrition in captivity, and that was quick. Last week we saw that within hours of when they were released. These medical officials saying that, and how concerned they are, how they had serious infections from captivity, things that were never treated. So it's really taking those initial things. Of course, I think the long term is going to be the mental side of the rehabilitation. That will take years, these officials say, but really it's dealing with their outer, I guess, more pressing items to begin with. But of course, all this will happen as they're reunited with their families, which is what we'll see first.
Right. Let's give credit to those hospitals, Sheba, Beilinson, Ichilov, that have handled these delicate situations very well in terms of course, prioritizing the well-being of the returning hostages, the sensitivities of the families, but also the Israeli public's desire to know and to see and know and get as much information about the returning hostages. It's a very difficult balancing act to be able to fulfill all those constituencies, and those hospitals and their teams have been very, I think, exemplary in able to do so.
And not only that, the privacy, right? For 500 days, these families have been in the center, in the press of the world, everybody wanting to know details, and now it's a point where they need some privacy, right? Because medical information about someone should be private, and it is a balancing act of everybody wanting to know how these hostages are, but also needing to respect the privacy and the journey of what's ahead for them medically.
Well, I do think, unfortunately, we're probably going to see more and more details coming out that are quite disturbing. I mean, just this past week or so, we've heard some updates about the status of Emily Damari, Romi Gonen. In the case of Romi Gonen, she's going to undergo, I think, a 20-something hour surgery because of the injuries that she sustained on October 7th and after that were never treated when she was in captivity. And, of course, we know Emily Damari, now famous for her, her own symbol of resistance, incredibly strong young women that we're seeing there, but nonetheless horrific experiences and more information that's coming out now about what they went through in captivity. Of course, we also have to mention Daniela Gilboa. I mentioned earlier that Hamas had her stage her own death, but in addition to that, she at one point had a life-threatening stomach illness because Hamas forced her to drink dirty water in Gaza. A lot of the time, these hostages were held without food, without water, certainly without clean drinking water, underground for months and months at a time, in some cases actually physically shackled.
We are getting the first statement from Sasha Trufanov's family right now, saying that they're overwhelmed with emotion and gratitude. Sasha's return home after 498 days. The statement went on to say that until says, quote, until Sasha's return to Israel, we don't know if he's aware that his father, Vitali, was murdered on October 7th. This knowledge or lack thereof will completely transform his homecoming from a day of great joy to one of deep mourning for his beloved father. So just to remember that even though these moments are going to be exciting, there's something after that they either will discover the knowledge of their families, the new realities will kick in for them after these reunifications. Kalev, you mentioned it's bittersweet. This is a bittersweet moment, right?
Absolutely.
So here it is. The reality is about to set in, but first we need to embrace the joy that will come and the pain soon after, unfortunately, for this family of Sasha.
Sure. And you mentioned, particularly when that first four women were released, young women soldiers, the Tatzpaniyot, and Emily Dabari and Romy Gonena, how we were amazed by their resilience, their defiance in the face of Hamas. And we focused on that. But as you said, as we know more of the details, we really understand how they were tested by their captivity, how the physical toll it took on them, how they're going to have to, the treatment the continuing treatment they're going to have to receive, and that does come out later on. Even though at the same time amazed that, for example, those women already have said they're ready to go back and serve in the Israeli army despite everything they've gone through.
We hear celebrations now. You can see on the screen now a large crowd is gathered in Hostage Square here in Tel Aviv in celebration.
Reading the Shachianu prayer.
Yes.
So as we wait for more updates from the IDF and the footage from their reception in Re'im and ultimately the reunification with their family, I want to go back to what the next steps are in terms of stage 2 or further, extension of stage 1. Kalev, what do we know so far?
Well, what we know is, as I said before, the phase 2 is supposed to involve negotiations about the so-called day after here in the Gaza Strip. What kind of political arrangement will there be for governing the Gaza Strip? Israel has made its position clear, fully backed by the United States. There is simply no way Hamas can remain in control, either militarily or politically in charge of the Gaza Strip. So what will be instead of Hamas? And that will be the negotiations. There are reports that an Israeli delegation, it's yet unclear, will be sent as a first step to Doha in Qatar. We mentioned the role of Qatar will be later this week. There have been reports that the members of that delegation will change. In the past, of course, it was headed by the heads of the Mossad and the Shabak, and that was primarily to deal with the hostage issue, really technical issues on the hostage issue. And now there are reports that now it will be more of a political representation that will take senior members of the Netanyahu government. Nothing's been absolutely confirmed to really get down to the nitty-gritty of who is going to be governing it. How this is, we don't have any details, though, about how these negotiations could proceed, where it could proceed, what kind of mandate the delegation will have. Again, Ron Dermer, the Strategic Affairs Minister, the probably member of the Israeli government and cabinet who is closest to Prime Minister Netanyahu, is reportedly supposed to now be heading this delegation. Not confirmed yet.
I do want to just interject. We have two more statements from the family of Yair Horn and Sagid Zekel-Khan. The first one is from Yair's family. They say, quote, after 498 days, Yair is returning home to us. Now we can breathe a little bit. Our Yair is home after surviving hell in Gaza. Now we need to bring Eitan back. Our family can truly breathe. Remember, Yair was taken and kidnapped with his brother Eitan, who was visiting for the Simchat Torah weekend on October 7th in 2023. They were separated, and he is set to be released in phase 2. And just one more moment of Sagid.
Just for our audience, I want to point out the vehicles believed to be holding the hostages are now being shown on the screen, driving by either to or from, I'm not sure which, Re'im base. Believe they're still coming from Re'im base to Re'im base. Yeah. So they will soon be reunited with the first few family members who are located at the base.
before ultimately being transferred to the hospital and to be reunited with the remainder of their family. At least in the case of American-Israeli Sagi Dekel-Khan, this will be a very, very exciting, heartwarming moment. The first time he's going to meet his now one-year-old daughter, Shachar.
Yeah,
right.
Unbelievable.
Keep in mind, we haven't seen any of those pictures live. That's something that's released.
That will come later,
They
right?
will come later. Again, the concern about the sensitivities of the family, want to give them that moment, that live moment in privacy, and then later, if those pictures are ones that are released.
Remember the last time Sagi saw his wife, she was 7 months pregnant. Now she has a 1-year-old child on her hands in addition to their 2 other daughters. So this is a different reality than when he left Israel, that's for sure. In the first statement of Sagi Dekel-Khan, his family, basically going back to the point of needing to release all of the rest of the hostages. They weren't specific anything about their family, but making sure that all hostages are returned, the live hostages and also the ones whose bodies are still being held in Gaza. The big emphasis for a lot of these families is they wanted this ceasefire hostage deal to include everyone, especially those bodies that are still in Gaza, making sure they return back home for proper burial. In Judaism, it's a complete circle when you have proper burial. And that's one of the reasons why Hamas continues to hold bodies. That's why they took dead bodies on October 7th, because they know that to the Jewish state, to Jews here in Israel, it is part of the process of transferring from life to death to bury the body in a very specific way, in a very timely manner. So that is one of the reasons why there are still so many bodies in Gaza.
Right, and you mentioned the phase 2. I was talking about the negotiations towards some kind of arrangement, which may take some time. We don't know what's going to look like. At the end of that period, supposedly all the hostages released, but there is a time element here. And the question is whether some kind of mechanism is going to be found to continue the release of hostages during the discussions of phase 2. That's a big question, because clearly the clock is ticking on some of those, the well-being of some of those hostages. And I think that is going to be maybe certainly the first priority for Israel, and I would say certainly the United States, to demand from Hamas they continue the release of hostages even during these discussions, even prior to some kind of agreement is going to be reached going forward onto the final answer of what's going to happen in Gaza.
There's now we're getting a very more specific statement from Sagi Dekel-Khan's family. They said, quote, "Our Sagi is home, a friend, son, partner, and most importantly, a father has returned." The statement went on to say he's finally on Israeli soil. In the coming hours, he will begin his rehabilitation process. He will meet his daughters Gali, Bar, and for the first time meet his little daughter Shachar, who was born while he was in captivity. Our hearts ache for everything he missed, but now he's here, unlike many others. And like we said, these families just will not stop fighting, getting these loved ones home. Another thing we saw yesterday is Or Levy actually came to Hostage Square here and was holding a sign. We know that these hostages left. They're now in Israel, but it's unbelievable how they made this now their life. When Gadi Moses returned back to Israel, he said, "I need to rebuild my kibbutz." These people, they feel as if there's a path forward for them, and they're trying to figure out how they can help facilitate all these hostages coming home. Remember, when they left captivity, they were separated from people they were held and got to know with for months. This is emotional for them to leave, and we know that a lot of them actually advocated for other people to come home instead of them. We heard that when the female soldiers were released, they were fighting to get Agam Berger home, who ended up coming home 1 week later, but still, it's the separation.
And Emily Damari as well offered to stay longer in order to allow Keith Siegel to be released, which of course Hamas refused, but really a level of heroism from these hostages that is unmatched.
And it's I think very important that the hostages, the families of those hostages who have been released, even going back to the first hostage deal in November, the year before November, that they have still been a key part of the movement, advocating both locally within Israel and pressuring the government. And we've seen some very emotional scenes in the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, agreement this week between members of hostage families and the Knesset members, the representatives, but also internationally, using it as a stage. They have not given up the struggle, even those that have either had their family members released or have had the information that their family members died in captivity or on October 7th. So that has been especially admirable. People that should be grieving, we should have been giving them the space to grieve, but no, they are continuing the struggle to get all the hostages released.
I think it's also important to note, you spoke about how Israel prioritizes even the the bodies of slain hostages. This, of course, is true, and in addition to the hostages who were kidnapped on October 7th, we have also seen as part of these negotiations hostages who were there prior to October 7th. Vera Mengistu, an Ethiopian Israeli struggling with a mental illness, has been held hostage for, I believe it is over 10 years now, and he is still believed to be alive in Gaza. He's on the list.
Hisham al-Sayyad, the Bedouin, who also reportedly might have some emotional issues and is also, at least to the best of our knowledge, alive and also in the hands of Hamas.
And of course we have the body of Hadar Golden, the soldier who has been held there for many years and has not been able, Israel's not been able to secure the release of his body. So the hostages who predate October 7th, as well as the bodies of those who were taken prior to October 7th, are supposed to be included in these negotiations, in future hostage releases. We're hopeful that we'll be able to get all of them home, but that remains to be seen.
Yeah, but the mission continues for Israel to get these bodies out. Just about 3 weeks ago, Israel actually was able to get the body back of an Israeli soldier who was dragged in 2014. And we mentioned the burial process in Judaism is so critical. It transfers this status of life to death and makes it permanent. And his family buried his remains immediately, because that's the process in Judaism, is you bury the remains immediately. There's a proper burial. And we said there's a tactic. There's a reason why Hamas drags in dead bodies on October 7th. It was reported this week that Shlomo Mansour's body was dragged in as well, and his body's being held there. So there is a process to all this, but these hostage families are fighting for every single person to come back, to come home, and to get everybody the proper needs and that they deserve.
All right, well, we are soon to be wrapping up this broadcast, as we have seen the safe return of now 3 more of our hostages: American-Israeli Sagid Dekel-Hen, Argentinian-Israeli Yair Horn, and of course the 3rd hostage, Alexandra Sasha Trufanov, the Russian-Israeli citizen. All of them looking comparatively well compared to the scenes that we saw last week at the hostage release. Remains to be seen what their actual physical status is. We know that they're being transferred to Re'im. I assume that they're already at Re'im base with the IDF in IDF hands, where they will undergo initial medical checks before being transferred to the hospitals to receive a more thorough checkup. But joining us now, we do have Yosef Haddad, an Arab Israeli social activist and a frequent commentator on international and national affairs. Yosef, what do you think of the scenes that we've seen today in this hostage release?
Well, first of all, from what I have saw on Al Jazeera, I can tell you one thing and one thing only. Hamas is panicking, Hamas is afraid, and all the psychological terror, whether it is by the photos that they're presenting or the the sand watch that they gave in order to pass it to one of the mothers of the hostages in Israel. All of it, it shows about how much Hamas is under pressure, and they're scared of the fact that the IDF will renew the war. They don't want that. They are scared of that. And they're scared of that because they know that once the IDF goes back into Gaza, they will be back into the, the holes that they came from. You won't see their Hamas uniforms. They're very clean, by the way.
With their stolen IDF weapons.
Which means that they never fought in him, which is funny because when there's a ceasefire, you see their uniform. When there's no ceasefire, you see them with not even one single green point on their uniform. And that itself just shows you how Hamas, the only way that they are keeping themselves or presenting themselves as the ruler of Gaza is by showing fake news, circus, no more than that. That's why we must not fell into that trap of that psychological terror trap set up by Hamas. And one more thing, the fact that they gave a golden gift.
Yeah, just for our viewers, I believe we did speak about how Hamas had given a gift to Sagi, American-Israeli Sagi Dekel Khan, upon the birth of his daughter, which took place a few months after he was kidnapped and held in captivity. The gift that they did give him was a golden watch. We've seen the same sort of cynical manipulation of hostages even today with these goodie bags that we see being given to the hostages with mementos and maps of Gaza.
And what do you think that shows? And to whom is this addressed? It's not addressed to the Palestinians in Gaza. This act. It's for two people. It's for the Israelis because they want to piss them off because this is who they are. And second, it's actually to the anti-Israel terror supporters in the West that they know that they will echo this. They will echo this and they will show, oh my God, look at Hamas. They're not a terrorist organization. They're an organization that give gift to someone they kidnapped, held over almost 500 days in captivity with no conditions, no food, and no basic human rights. And now that you're releasing them, you give him a gift to your kid. Who do you think is going to echo that? All the pro-Palestinian terror supporters in the West. It's sickening me. And you know what? This disgusting act just shows again and again how weak Hamas are. And we need to make sure everybody understands that. And the only reason why we Israelis, we're the only one who's not feeling actually winning or any satisfaction is because we have one Israeli hostage, one soldier that fell in battle, one Israeli was killed on the 7th of October or in this war. It is a whole war for us, and that's why we will never feel victorious, because despite the fact that we decimated Gaza, we decimated Hamas, despite the fact that today a lot of the Arab world thinks that Israel is back on the map when it comes to the strength of Israel in the Middle East. All that, it doesn't matter, because one Israeli life is a whole world. And by the way,
I just want to note for our viewers now, I think on the screen we do have some footage of the hostages arriving in Reim. But Yosef and Kalev, I wanted to hear from both of you. I mean, what do you expect the attitude, the feeling is on the ground in Gaza amongst the Palestinian population? I mean, we know that this has been a horrific war also for them with a lot of destruction, and yet you still see so many terror supporters on the ground. We see polls showing that the majority of Palestinians still support Hamas. Really, really alarming, information coming from Gaza. Kalev.
Well, first of all, I'm extremely distrustful of any polls or surveys that are done by a population that is being ruled by a terror group that they know will retaliate against anyone who speaks up against them. So I'm extremely leery of that. And I certainly agree with Yosef that everything what we see Hamas is doing is, in one hand, yes, a message trying to the outside world, also to the Arab world. And I want to hear what Yosef's thoughts about that, because we are moving into the phase of negotiations where countries like Egypt, Jordan, the Emirates, and maybe Saudi Arabia are going to have to make a decision whether they are going to take a stand against Hamas now. And Hamas is desperately trying to kind of reassert its legitimacy by these, as we mentioned before, the ceremonies it's been holding with the Red Cross, these signing off ceremonies. But also, the question is, why did Hamas this week try to blow up the hostage deal by claiming that Israel was not supplying humanitarian aid, even though even the United Nations backed Israel? That was because it's fighting now a war for the hearts and minds of the Gazans, trying to say, oh, look, we're the ones who are trying to bring the humanitarian aid into Israel. We're the ones fighting for it. They're trying to do that because of a lack of weakening support within Gaza.
And it's not part of the agreement. We must insist on telling any materials for infrastructure and buildings are not allowed. And the reason why they're not allowed is because all also Israel doesn't want to give Hamas the opportunity to rehabilitate Gaza. They want to show the Gazans that Hamas is not capable of doing that. But also, if you take a look, I just, when I came here, there was a debate or sort of a conversation actually on Al Jazeera, and trying to understand what is the meaning of migrating all Gazans outside of Gaza. And one of the commenters says, okay, let's assume that 50% of the less radical Gazans would leave. That will leave Gaza with another million people, all of them supporters of Hamas. And I say, good, good, good. Make that 100% supporters of Hamas, so we can enter and literally just demolish Hamas supporters and Hamas themselves. It will make our job much easier. So maybe this is what we should do. And another message that was there, they're saying the only place we're going to and migrate is only Jerusalem. Come on, guys. You started this war on the 7th of October under the fake name of Al-Aqsa flood. You wanted to release Jerusalem. You wanted to free Jerusalem. You wanted to be there. And what now you're fighting? You're fighting on staying in Gaza. And then you have the audacity to come. Yes, and then you have the audacity to come and say, we won, you stupid terrorist organization. You lost, and you lost big time. And again, I'll say it, the only reason why we're not feeling like this is because only one Israeli needed to be fallen in battle, whatever it is, for us to not feel winning. And one last point that I would like to refer, because a lot of people keep asking me, is the life of Israeli worth more than the life of Palestinian? And the answer is absolutely yes. And it's not us determine that. It's the Palestinians themselves determine that. Because today I made the equation, and I saw for every one hostage, Israeli hostage we're releasing, we are releasing 123 terrorists, Palestinian terrorists. You guys made the equation that the life of an Israeli is way more important and more than any life of Palestinians. So that's it. We should just say the truth.
I want to ask about today specifically. We saw a very organized Palestinian Islamic Jihad and Hamas handover. In the past, we saw Palestinian Islamic Jihad have a very chaotic moment. Remember, in the past, their handovers were separated, and it was likely because PIJ wanted their own moment to glorify that they also were holding hostages. What did you think of today's orchestrated, although organized, release of these hostages together, both groups?
This is totally weakness from our side. Because you know something, after the 7th of October, and since we managed to decimate Hezbollah, we sent Nasrallah and his replacement to hell. We literally bombed 4,000 of their activists in the most amazing war tactics, which is the pager blowing up tactics. We made a revolution in Syria. We targeted and we attacked in Tehran. We attacked in Yemen. Until today, they are trying to put up the fire out in Hodeidah and in Sana'a. We managed to bring the strength of the Israeli force of the IDF way back there in the Arab world. The Arab world respects the IDF. I know that because I have so many people from the Arab world talking to me, sending me messages, telling me, Yusuf, the IDF is back on the top in the Middle East. And we did not translate that power from the military power into the diplomatically power, because unfortunately, the fact that we're seeing scenes like this, if we have the strength that we did it in the battle, but in the negotiations, we would have not allowed them to do something like this. We, from the beginning, would be in the negotiation. You hand us the hostages, you put them in the car, bring them back to us, and we will give you your terrorists back to you guys. And that's it.
We saw this in November of 2023. Remember?
True.
Right. And so more than a year later, they've had time to plan out these ceremonies.
This is my. Absolutely. It is Al Jazeera, and we know that Al Jazeera is orchestrating that, and in fact, they're the one who's directing that. Yeah.
We spoke about it.
But I will say again, this is the criticism that I have towards my country when it comes to the negotiation, because look, we have achieved a lot militarily, and we should have translated that achievement into that negotiation, and we failed. Part of it we failed is because we don't have the mentality of the Middle East. Part of the fact that we don't have the mentality of the Middle East because in the negotiation table there weren't Arab Israelis who love this country, want to represent this country, and I can tell you and point on some of those Arab Israelis on the top levels of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or in the government that they can literally be part of the negotiation. They understand the mentality, they speak the language, they know every small nuance on those people, on those monsters. And the fact that they weren't there, it was something that against us and not to our advantage, and that's too bad.
You know, Yusuf, we've spoken a lot on this broadcast about the next stage. Will there be a phase 2? Will there be an extension of phase 1? I'm wondering what your take is on these negotiations in the next steps. You know, as we see these glorious moments of reunification, we also have to keep our eyes on the prize and bringing home all of the remaining hostages. What do you anticipate seeing?
I'll tell you one thing. You know, I always spoke, you know, whether it's here in Israel or abroad, and I said, because, again, listen to this is really important, because of the fact that we managed to put back Israel as the superior country when it comes to military force. Put back Israel on the top of the Middle East, and everybody again respects the IDF. Whether Hamas is saying this or their supporters saying that, I don't care. I can tell you exactly what the leaders and those who are not supporting of Hezbollah or or the Iranian regime, they know that they don't want to mess with Israel. Because we arrived to this level, and because we are back to be respected as a military, as a force in the Middle East, I'll tell you this. Unfortunately, we have to swallow that bitter pill, yeah? Because we need and we must see all our hostages home. And because of the fact that the IDF did their job, we need to understand that despite the fact that the deal is not good, because of lack of good negotiation from our side, we need to end this deal. We need to bring all our hostages back again, and then once we do that, open hell on Hamas.
Kalev, what do you anticipate seeing?
Again, I do think there has been, and I agree with Yosef there, Israel has not been able to translate its success militarily in Gaza into diplomatic success. There's many reasons for that. Partially that has to do with the composition of Benjamin Netanyahu's government and parties that wouldn't even allow him to move in that direction, explore possibilities. And a big part of that is the neighboring Arab states that have a stake in it, and I'm talking here primarily about Egypt, Jordan, the Emirates, and Saudi Arabia, basically sticking to the old paradigms of saying, okay, no, we just have to go along. It has to be, what are the solution? It'll be the Palestinian Authority, which has shown itself unable to govern or maintain security over the Gaza Strip coming in, or it immediately going to a Palestinian state. The Arab states have stuck to that paradigm during this whole period. And that is one of the speculations, is that is why President Trump put forward, certainly coming from the United States, this radical proposal of transferring, at least temporarily, the Gazans out, Gazan residents out of the Gaza Strip to try to break that deadlock. And the question is, to what degree we're going to see that and change that paradigm. Look, I don't want to, it's impossible to make any predictions in the Middle East. Who would have predicted that Bashar al-Assad would fall for power today? But there have been many plans put forward. Maybe the Gaza Strip becomes an Arab protectorate. Countries like Egypt, Jordan, even the Saudis taking control of it. There's a process by which Hamas leadership goes into exile into other countries, and that's together with a release of the hostages. We're a long way from there yet. But certainly something has to move. The old paradigms have been shattered, and new thinking has to come out about what to do.
And by the way, I totally agree with the fact that the Arabs are going back, the Arab countries are going back to the same thing, which is backing the Palestinians just because they're Arabs, just because they're from the Arab world.
Although not actually, of course, helping the Palestinians. Even prior to October 7th, it was an Egyptian-Israeli blockade. As we know, two countries who were enforcing this blockade on Gaza, they accepted 0 refugees, 0.
But I'll tell you more than that. Remember the huge interview on Al Arabiya channel with the former ambassador of Saudi Arabia to the United States, and through that interview, the former ambassador literally admits and says, we stood next to the Palestinians despite the fact that we knew that they were on the wrong and Israel was on the right, but we stood next to them only because they are Arabs. He said that. It's literally, I'm quoting him, okay? Which again reveals that a lot of the nations, or Arab nations, knows that Israel is on the right side here, and they still stand next to the Palestinians just because the Palestinians are Arabs. I as an Arab, you know, not only resent that, I pity that, and I hope that we will have strong Arab leaders in the future. We've seen even in the Emirates, leaders saying enough is enough, and the fact is that every place the Palestinians were in an Arab nation, they destroyed it.
Which is why countries like Egypt and Jordan have stated clear they don't want the Palestinians coming in, even temporarily.
Yeah, because they're saying that they don't want the Palestinians because they want the Palestinians to hang in their own land.
Right.
Nonsense. Do not believe that. Do not. It's
I
because
think
they
it's
don't
pretty
want
clear based on history why the Arab states don't want a large population of Palestinians from Gaza. This is a society that's very radicalized. Not everyone, of course. And the Arab countries do have bad experiences when it comes to allowing Palestinian groups in. We saw absolute chaos, civil war in Lebanon, of course, over many years.
They got kicked out from Kuwait.
That's correct. They sided with Saddam Hussein and were expelled from Kuwait. So there's a lot of problematic experiences in the Middle East. It's not really surprising, but of course it is kind of sickening to see yet again them trying to use Palestinians as a pawn in this conflict rather than deal with the issues themselves.
I want to read a quick statement the Prime Minister's office released. They said, quote, this week as well, Hamas attempted to violate the agreement and create a false crisis with baseless claims. These are the claims of humanitarian aid, no tents. The statement continues to say, quote, thanks to the concentration of our forces inside and around the Gaza Strip and due to President Trump's clear and unequivocal statement, Hamas backed down and the release of the hostages is continuing. They said they're working in full coordination with the U.S. to get the living and the fallen hostages out as quickly as possible, and they say, quote, they're fully prepared for what lies ahead in every aspect. So that's the latest from them.
All right. Well, I would like to...
Have you seen this footage of the terrorists that we're about to set free? And they were putting in a T-shirt with the Star of David on it, and I believe it's one of the symbols of the IDF units. And then in Arabic it says,
We're going to see if we can get up this this image for you shortly.
لن ننسى ولن نغفر, which means we will not forget and we will never forgive. And you know what? It's about time. It's about time for us to arrive to the Middle East and do exactly like this. I'm very, very, very satisfied seeing something like this. They should be released like this, knowing that we will not forget and we will never forgive them, and we will hunt them down. Just tolerance. Everyone who are pro-Israeli, be patient. Sabr, savlanut. We will get you. We will get you.
I mean, Israel has shown the capability, even over decades.
Do you remember
to exact
Munich?
justice?
Do you remember Munich?
To exact justice on
we set
terrorists.
up a new unit just to target the terrorists of Munich, Olympic in Munich. And you know what? I believe that we will eventually seal the deal also with those terrorists. We will never forget, and we will never forgive them.
All right. Well, I want to give you guys all a final word as we are wrapping up. We do know the hostages are at Re'im base, probably already reunited, and we'll look forward to seeing those images on ILTV later. However, for now, Shosh, last words?
Last words is that 3 male hostages walked out of Gaza today, surviving hell of 500 days, reuniting with their families. We don't know what their conditions are mentally, physically, but we do know they had the strength to survive this amount of time, and they're back in Israel.
Caleb.
You know, over the past almost 15 months, just wondering whether these families, the Trufanov, Horn, Dekelchen families that I've spoken to, whether they are going, and sometimes I question it myself, whether they are going to get to see their loved ones back safe and sound. And just to think about that, now that has happened, it's happening as we speak. To me, that with all the issues that we've raised, rightly so, that to me is what the essence of this day is about.
Yosef, your final take.
Well, one more time, we're literally here in this unbelievable square where Israelis are gathered to see the hostages. Our hostages are back home. And that's my message abroad to the world. Don't believe all the fake news. The majority of Israelis want their hostages back home, and it doesn't matter whether you are an Arab or a Jew, whether you're a secular or a religion, whether you are with left views or right views. We want our hostages here, and when we are united, we, the Israeli society, are strong together, and this is what we want to do. We want to see them, all the hostages back. We still have a lot of hostages in Gaza that we need to see them back home. Hopefully we'll see them as soon as possible, because this is the only way we will feel whole again. And after that, we will put our efforts to eliminate our enemies.
Am Yisrael Chai, the people of Israel.
All right, well, this concludes our coverage of the hostage release of Sagid Dekelchen, Yair Horn, and, of course, Sasha Trufanov. I want to thank all our viewers for tuning in. Thank you to Caleb Ben David, Yosef Haddad for joining us, and Shosh Bedrosian for your coverage. Thank you for tuning in. I'm Emily Schrader. Have a good day.